Tonight it is a pleasure to introduce Neil Denari, who has agreed to hold this discussion with me tonight about his work. I will only outline an introduction because I think most of you know him, and I'd really like to jump right in. Just a few facts before we begin. Neil Denari studied at the University of Houston and the GSD, established his firm NMDA in Los Angeles in 1988, which practices and is very well renowned around the world. And he's the recipient of several important honors, including, just to name two, the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Architecture and the United Artists Award for Architecture. He's a distinguished educator who has taught in leading schools in the U.S. and in Europe, and was Director of SCI-Arc from 1997 to 2002, is a professor now of architecture at UCLA, and as you know, is teaching an option studio here now. I think I speak for the wider architectural world in saying that his work is widely regarded to be the most refined and experimental in the genre of machinist modernism, to which he has undoubtedly added to the repertoire. Simply put, his work decidedly represents a concrete and theoretical contribution to the discipline, therefore. He has isolated a section of the spectrum of the modernist idiom, and with it established a new relationship between new and old, within the language of modularity, structure, exterior envelope, and interior envelope. That he has added the category of the interior envelope is remarkable. It is a theme in his work that I believe deserves to be examined much further. I've known his work since my graduate days at the GSD, and ever since he has been a guidepost for our generation. And yet he continues to surprise me. And last year I experienced one of those moments in the Guggenheim Museum in New York, where I found myself envying his work. And I should tell you that, when you experience envy, you know you're in trouble, and you also know that you're really facing something very important. The show was on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Guggenheim, the Building of Rights. And everyone there in that show was required to do a single drawing to represent the building or an idea about the building. Ooh. This is on, and it will cause trouble if it is. What he did, which for me was by far the most exciting of all of those drawings, was he showed a passenger jet flying vertically, violently and perfectly through, or driving through, having landed or about to take off, in this skewed position in the atrium of the Guggenheim. It is lodged there very nicely. It rescales the plane and the Guggenheim. It likens the body of architecture to the body of the jetliner in a way. It makes them one and the same kind of thing. They are here together in a very unusual way. Now, on the one hand, he seems to me to be recollecting a very important idea. Le Corbusier's car and pavilion, Parthenon comparison, where, Corbusier analogizes the Parthenon with naked polished steel. The standardization of the Greek temple was as up to date in its time as our standardized machines are for us today, but not our buildings then. The Parthenon is very contemporary in that sense, but the machine only could be contemporary in Corbusier's time. And so Denari's fuselage is sort of in the same way, re-dynamizing the Guggenheim and bringing a kind of evocation of the fluid dynamics of eddies and flows and the force of air that you could imagine, with this enormous pressure building as this plane is either, entering or about to take off, or whatever it may be that it will happen imminently when you look at the Guggenheim with the jet inside. This graphic, this kind of representation suspended in this pictorial space, out of time and place, reoriented. The Guggenheim is no longer given definition according to any particular architectural orientation. Rather, the plane dominates here. So it is utterly contemporary, again, the museum, with this introduction of this machine in it. And I would say also there is the specter of a certain kind of horror. In fact, Neil told me that, because of the potential to recognize 9/11 in this image, he was for some time disallowed to put this into the exhibit, which is very interesting too. I mean, so it's contemporary in every way you could almost imagine. Okay, now, having thought about it this way, or let's say that, the machine is coming in for a crash landing, or architecture is a crash landing. I don't know which. The threshold for this landing. You could say in a way, that the Guggenheim does not live up to the airplane, just as the architecture could not live up to the automobile for Corbusier. I mean, in a way, this is a kind of prognosis for architecture, or potentially a kind of reflection on that question. And I guess I'd like to start by asking Neil if you would tell us what this means. I mean, if my interpretation could be said to sort of set the stage for discussion about the state of architecture that your work sets up for us to understand it through, what does this mean? You kind of emancipate the Guggenheim, but in doing it, the machine prevails here, I would say. The fragmentary state of architecture, its static condition, remains. And as a hypothesis, what does this mean? I mean, where are we going with that? I mean, where do you go from there? I mean, it is such a brilliant encapsulation of the problematic in contemporary terms, but how do you move forward from there?
I think the quality of the image, and we called this like a still from an unmade movie, as though, there's action in the piece, but it's implied.
Right.
How did it get there is the main question. And that, for me, was one of the curious kind of conundrums in that I wanted to kind of open up. And all of the reactions that you had are some of the kind of collateral effects that I couldn't quite predict. But this was a virtual project. No one would get to build a project. And we actually spent a few weeks trying to design something, quote, original. And I felt like nothing worked at some particular level. And perhaps what didn't work was that the void as a space to be able to sort of design something personal seemed less important than invoking Frank Lloyd Wright and the 20th century and the kind of apex of his work and modernism in a way in 1959. And so I just sort of said flight times Frank Lloyd Wright and the Guggenheim equals, the 20th century. And that's, in many ways, this image is an endgame of the 20th century. But the reason why we put it in is we wanted the most virtual project there could be, which is you will never find an A380 in this space. It will never be there, right? So that's the first level of impossibility. The counter to that is it's made and rendered accurately as though it's been there and we photographed it.
The right scale, isn't it?
It's absolutely the right scale, and all the details are exactly correct, but you'll never find it in there. It would never even be in there like in the Museum of Modern Art. There's a helicopter, but it's small enough to get in there and suspend, right? The other idea of how did it get there, besides the fact that we just modeled it and rendered it, is it's very, very specifically placed in the image, so it didn't fly in, it didn't crash in, it was virtually constructed, within the space. I actually didn't think that the animate aspect of it would be so powerful, and also the negative reference to 9/11 was never there. But, it's funny to have all of that kind of reaction come out of it, because I thought, how could I be so naive as to not have predicted anything with an airplane inside a volume of a building in New York wouldn't connote that. And in that sense, maybe I was naive, but that certainly wasn't.
Which one is more like your work? If I had to take three things here, is it, the plane inside the Guggenheim, and somehow this dialectic, whether or not it evokes a crash or imminent flight or the filmic still shot, all of those things, or do you identify more so with Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim, with the way it sequences and dynamizes a certain experience of the museum, or is the airplane, is the fuselage, the graphic encasement of this machine, which one is most like your work, or any of these?
I think it's in a kind of an autobiographical way. It's also an end game to a certain reading of the work, because before we were able to build, where the idea of occupying space became really the primacy of it all, the obsession with the object, and all of the kind of heavy reference that machine modernism had. This is basically a kind of a Russian doll effect, which is there's a big volume, there's a void inside that volume, then there's another solid, and inside that solid there's another void inside the airplane. And so for me, it's a sort of relational situation between void and object that is going on in the work now. And so it's sort of, you can't attribute one quality or another to sort of what we're working on now.
But right now, I mean, if everybody were to say, what's the big moment of Neil? It's presently the building in New York, isn't it? Really, I mean, right now, just everyone is seeing it. The just finished. It's HL 23, not 23 HL. Highline 23, which I believe most of you know about. And I would say it's more like the plane than it's like the Guggenheim. I mean, it's more like the plane without the Guggenheim.
I would agree that it is, and partly it's because the program being so repetitive and also private, not a public project, and also a project that's, in terms of its space, it's dominated by real estate, not by the demands of or the whims of the architect in a way. So,
yeah, and you've argued that there's a kind of performative principle behind it, that the idea of trying to gain airspace over the Highline, the cantilever, motivated this structure.
Right.
And so you're kind of evoking Corbusier here, on the right side, the argument he would be making about the automobile, more so than, let's say, what he talks about when he's looking at the Parthenon. And
that's me.
Yeah.
You got to go back, though.
That's okay. And so I really wanted to kind of...
Want to stop there?
No, I think we should go into the HL 23 now and try to sort of talk about a number of things about how you bring to bear the machinic in the language of that envelope. One of the things you said earlier today when we had a conversation that might turn out to be better than the one we had before all of you, because it was just completely unplanned, was that you said that there was a period that you had experienced shortly after the school time when the architects were so invested in abstraction and evacuating architecture of meaning and a cultural content. And this project had run aground, this kind of period. It was a kind of reaction against the postmodern, I guess. And then that you were, of course, reinvesting it with cultural meaning and content and such things. And I guess my question would be, and you said something else key, which was that people were trying to move away from architecture, that this emptying out was, always to kind of remove architecture from its history, to gain a greater distance from everything that had come before. And I guess my question would be, how is it that the machine is the better referent for you than architecture? It seems to me it is. I still believe, I'm placing before you my position that I think for you, your sympathies lie with the jet, with its graphic, more so than with Corbusier's plastic development of three-dimensional space. So I want you to kind of go with that, or tell us about HL. We can come back to that question and other things about HL, but I really want to hear how HL 23 plays in relation to that, what I think of as a prognosis of contemporary architecture in the Guggenheim piece.
Well, I think I would sort of just go on record and say that the that the kind of technological overtones of whatever you see at one level, especially like in HL23, as I'll show, actually are just about the conditions of building in a way that I feel like have shifted from certain types of heavy references to more contemporary ones. I'll argue for it, and hopefully you'll agree, because I think at one level the story that you're kind of referring to was sort of, I didn't say it, but it was Sanford came to my office, and we were discussing this piece that he wrote in the first zone on Einstein and the relative field, and that the problem of sort of the mechanical paradigm and the introduction of electrotexture with people like Ito and so forth. You remember the Any magazine sort of era, and that it seemed to be an end in terms of the weighted references of modernism, and that what everybody was dealing with was essentially a kind of very post-Venturian world of form matters, but unlike exposing and going back into the stockpile of history, like in Las Vegas, the Las Vegas that Venturi referred to he didn't refer to abstraction. He referred to cultural forms that were referential. The idea of fluidity and folding became a kind of codification for the thing which didn't have any reference, and that was everything solid melting into air.
Right.
So I felt compelled by that at some level, and felt that the work had run its course at some level. That was 20 years ago, and so it's been 20 years to work through not so much the kind of leaving behind of the residue of the formalisms or the language, because if you make a stainless steel handrail in an interior, they go, well, you like machines, which is not the case. But I want to show I wanted to very quickly just kind of outline a couple things with two quotes. Kubrick, and this is what Kubrick said about making a film. When you're making a film, in addition to any higher purpose, you must be interesting. So, most people who've seen 2001 think it's boring. So apparently for many, he wasn't interesting enough because it didn't have a lot of dialogue. And yet it was visually, it's considered to be one of the great spectacles of all time. So he was interesting at one level in a different kind of programmatic project. Mies, and this is what he said, I don't want to be interesting, I want to be good. And I just wanted to draw the distinction between, is it valid for an architect to want to be interesting? Or can you not be interesting or want to be interesting because architecture is not about entertainment? Because after all, who would go to a film knowing it was boring? No one would ever pay the money to go, I want to go see a boring film. Of course I want to go see an interesting film. But architecture isn't supposed to entertain in the same sense of removal from reality and so forth. So we imagine Mies to not only unload the burden of invention, but also to lock architecture into a kind of pragmatist role where it's not dancing elephants and people jumping around, doing things. It's, making a project about service. And I guess I want to kind of claim that, good and interesting are not to be sort of opposed at one level. And I want to try to kind of articulate the program of what does it mean to be interesting, at least in this particular project. This is in Chelsea, in Manhattan. The site is at 23rd Street at the Highline. It's about 50 meters to the west of 10th Avenue. We know the site and the project. This is in 2005, looking south along the Highline. It's got this kind of erstwhile garden. Our site is in blue. As you know, New York, nothing was built in New York for probably 40 years, not since sort of Madison Avenue and the rise of... basically since the Guggenheim and Lever and so forth. Global wealth finally migrated back into the form of architecture. However, one can go on and on about the shift from, just the currency of money into, architecture, which is part of that level of kind of identity. But for better or worse, the city became a site of experimentation within a market for which there was a lot on the line, I guess, in terms of money. Our client came and said, I have this site. It's a site for which you could build a 25-foot wide building with a 15-foot setback. That's this special West Chelsea zoning. And he said, it's too small. I can't get the kind of return I want. We have all the FAR we need. In fact, he shipped FAR off the site to another location. So the building isn't overbuilding FAR, but he said you have to make it bigger than what the zoning will allow if you can manage to get it approved. I promise I'll build it. Of course, the promise to build was just the incentive for us to kind of keep working at one level, but this is the volume that you could build. The interesting thing about the project and the site, which actually starts to make this idea of the graphic become let's say, a condition of media that you could track from the hardware of modernism to the content of a kind of post-war media, landscape, where it's not about what the TV looks like anymore, it's about what you see on the TV, which too was also a kind of set of references to the electronic paradigm. It was always about fluidity and content and movement and not about the weight and fixity. Mm-hmm. But fluidity and nothingness doesn't make buildings very easily unless they're perforated, made out of glass, and move around and have a lot of attributes attached to them. I actually wasn't interested in that so much as trying to find, I think in this particular project, a way in which the captive audience of the Highline, because there's going to be literally millions of people walking up and down this site in a way that's different than walking around, let's say, one of your buildings in the round, or driving around it, as a kind of rotational field. Mm-hmm. It's already set up as a kind of axial field of frontality. So the section is where we had the opportunity to kind of develop the project. That's just a plan reference. There's one apartment per floor and a very micro lobby on the ground floor on the left. Now the project is really more about geometry than it is about the prism of the geometry as much as it is about the specifics of the hardware of the skin. And in fact, we didn't develop the skin a priori. We just knew solid and void. And the void had to be on the north and south facades because that's where the views are going to be in perpetuity. And we had a program of opacity on the east side for privacy. And that was given by the client. By the time we deal with these kind of ambitions to set the building back in a different way, for instance, the top slopes rather than steps back in a wedding cake fashion, mm-hmm. And that was a waiver, and the building at the bottom has to deal with this condition, which is also a condition of the building relative to the Highline, because the Highline goes 5 feet into the site, et cetera, et cetera. So by the time we essentially attack the limitations and generate this prism, the building sort of responds volumetrically in its own one-off way, kind of customized, bespoke way. And then we set about to sort of construct, the project based on the program in many ways that was given to us. Mm-hmm. The structural frame and the relationship of the skin to the frame is where a lot of the kind of questions for many people occur, which is, what's the graphic design in the skin about? Mm-hmm. And, the simple answer is, it's really about reading the structure, but actually I need to give you a kind of halo or doppelganger of it to be able to read it from 25 blocks away. Because otherwise, the Mecco shades are going to come down in front of the diagonals, and you don't see the frame of the building. That's just the basic conditions of occupancy. So actually, the graphic design works. It works in many ways as a kind of second, level structure. And so I'm saying that the graphic project has its references to modernism in terms of this does that. Uh-huh. But it's also dishonest in the way in which anybody would kind of talk about machinic modernism as a part does a certain thing. And I think it's referencing that, but it's all 2D and it's immaterial at some particular level. So the relationship between the geometry as it sits in the site, the kind of robust nature of the structure, and the decorative aspects, let's say, of the panels, which I'll kind of go into. If you kind of sum all that up, it might be legitimate for you to say you're still into machines and you're still into technology and you're still into the kind of set of codes and references that remind us of that. Metallic surfaces, let's say, versus concrete or stone. I'm not arguing on local context, like the Highline is steel, the building is steel. I don't actually talk about it in those terms at all, because that wasn't really the kind of guiding ambition. It was probably a lot more, I would say, even more poetic than that, as I'll show you in the images. But the north facade and the south facade, as you're walking along the Highline, this is a bit like, do you know Michael Snow's Wavelength, the film where he's just zooming in on a set of windows in a loft, and then there's J.G. Ballard's text called the 60-minute zoom, which is a zoom on a balcony of a hotel. Mm-hmm. This is a bit like that, where it's the body is just getting closer and closer and closer to the building, so you see, quote, less and less of it. And the flattening of the building gives way, like in the image on the left, to a fairly dynamic rotational building. So the illusion of depth that you see here shifts, obviously, when you're on the Highline here. It's really activated by the Highline, and it's very, very specific in that sense. These are just some images from the context. When you look at the building on the oblique, it operates so much more differently, and the building wasn't, quote-unquote, designed for that particular condition as much as it was about the condition of the north and the south, because of the program and the glazing and so forth. Our client actually asked us, originally the skin came all the way to here, and he's all the way to the edge of the east corner,
the east skin,
and he demanded that we return the glass on the corner.
Why not the other corner?
That's a party wall.
No. Why is the north? The north east corner not
why not
also
this one?
Returned? Yeah.
That's the bedroom, and he wanted more privacy. And this is the public space, and so corner glass makes sense. Curiously, this was it could have been
an inside-out motivation.
Yeah, it was a bit like designing a car, which is there's styling going on, but there's also a sort of relation between the chassis, the interior, the ergonomics, and so forth. So we pushed the structural frame as far as we could to the face of the building so that we could have a pretty clear relationship between the frit and the structural steel. Couple of, let's say, graphic / I wouldn't say illusionistic agendas are going on, but one of the things about the building is it's not really as tall and slim as it appears, because we wanted to, let's say, change the idea that a building stratified 14 times grounds the thing in a kind of Cartesian reference that we knew that we would never be able to overcome, but we tried in two ways. Mm-hmm. And that was to get rid of the spandrel glass with a prefabricated system. I'll just kind of go back. The glass goes from floor to floor, and the structure is back, obviously, behind. Here's the steel tubes. They're 8 inches. And there's a big structural steel beam that's connected to the mega panels of the glass, which actually stabilizes the glass panel. But we work pretty hard not to have any of the floor slab or the floor package register in the glass. So we get rid of one set of lines, which is not new. There's the atlas of all of the panels. And there they are in Shenzhen, where they came from. And you can see the the mega panels, how they're put together. It's all welded steel, so the profiles are pretty slim. And as you can see, and the other thing, the frit pattern is not repetitive, and it's not meant to be efficient in the way in which, let's say, you'd use a screen on a piece of glass to repeat a pattern around it, let's say like a Herzog project. Mm-hmm. This was very much like everything is unique at that level, and the diagonals go 3 floors rather than chevron per floor. That would have accentuated the kind of stacking effect. So graphically, we're just trying to make the building do different things. I threw that in just because the building's handmade as much as it's factory made, just like, you know, an exotic car at some particular level. Also, the scale of the glass, this is 11.5 feet. It's pretty tall. It's 6 feet wide.
For a residential building.
Yeah, they're very, very, very big. There's the size. You can actually walk through that process of building it.
This flattening, we're going to be looking at some images of some other buildings that deal with this what I would call colossal scale, of the scale that contests the stacking, you know, that goes against the stacking, to try to represent the building not as that kind of successive condition, but as something that's more like a single piece, something super singular in a way. What is the ambition there? I mean, to identify it as a unique monument in the city? I mean, how would you characterize the ambition to give it this scale, to cancel the actuality of its scale?
That's part of the kind of set of questions for the studio that I'm doing here. And I'll just try and kind of talk about the cultural ambition to do that, which is, and it's pretty experimental as far as I'm concerned, and that is if quite a lot of our contemporary life is carried out in 2D. Yeah, there's architecture, it's around. We don't get information from architecture, we use it in a different way. What I was trying to do, and what we have been trying to do, is figure out a way if architecture can adopt certain effects, media effects, in this case using graphic design to make the building look like it's 4 chunks rather than 14. Not so that it entertains, but that it's interesting. And I'm drawing the distinction between entertaining in film, in the way Kubrick put it, and interesting as in, look, it's part of the experience of walking down the Highline, and what will you offer people? Because I feel like it's a public building more than it's a private building because of its position in the city. And in this particular case, the ambition graphically to do different things with the way in which it reads volumetrically is really the program of the project. It's obviously the program we gave to it. Our client didn't ask us to do that. City planning didn't ask us to do it. But I would argue it's the very reason why it was accepted. Otherwise, it would have been rejected because they wanted to not have this become a precedent-setting project. So in many respects, the ambition to do something different optically and prismatically, which connects to this idea of architecture becoming a little bit more like media, because it should get in between the schism between the digital world and the world of 2D, and architecture as a guardian of space and reality. I acknowledge I'm trying to lodge or float the work in between those conditions, and I'm not trying to use architecture to protect against immediacy or the ephemeral or trend or anything like that. Yet at the same time, I'm not offering it up as a super consumable project like you're just going to throw it away. You don't spend $50 million and do that. So that's the ambition at that particular moment, and it kind of pervades some of the other projects
You've
as well.
thwarted it in my critique because you've done it yourself. I mean, so there have been times when you've discussed the building much more strictly as the result of the conditions which required the cantilever, and your kind of mastery of these constraints. Because today the discourse in the academy is much more dedicated to the idea of the constraints and the aspiration to performance at a certain level, in a kind of remaking of the functionalist imperative of the modern period, is the main alibi for everything. This has become the kind of driving discourse, I think. One of the driving discourses is to sort of explain why we have done the things we have, and to say they had to be that way. But you are quite willing to, let's say, be openly confess that you have had other motives. Is that something, by the way, I'd be interested to know, do you discuss those motives that are outside of purposefulness in other contexts, or is this something that you would direct more exclusively to an audience like this, an architectural kind of crowd of people? This is a kind of an interesting question today, because I think...
Probably mostly to an audience like this, although I've given lectures to lay audiences where I've tried to make some of the same kind of arguments known, just because I actually think that the root of this work is not based in, it's not like having read something obscure and you're trying to kind of interpret it. This is a bit like, it's almost like the question of 50 years from now, the people who will be commissioning architecture were brought up a different way, right? They won't have the same ballast, the same histories, and it'll be deeply dominated by other types of experiences. And it's a bit like I want to annex that into the present, right? To be able to see if there's a different set of behaviors or reactions to the way in which stuff works. At the end of the day, the apartments are fine, they're great, the core is in the right place, the powder room's in the right place, right. The views are tremendous, there's plenty of walls to hang your pictures on, you can put your piano where... All of that's fine.
I don't know quite where we are, because I know you wanted to describe some of these questions.
You can go through that stuff.
But I wanted to jump to this question a little bit and go a little bit more detail about this treatment of the skin and the structure. Because, on the one hand, everything you've said, it makes sense to me that this gigantic scale does what you said. But there are other ways you could do it, and I really want to know a little bit more about why you do it the way you do it. So, for example, when I look at this, you've already said it. The graphic reproduces what's happening. That tubular structure just behind it, we understand the relationship between, what Eisenman would call the sign and the signified. In a way, you've tried to make the distinction. But, you look at a building like this, you could say it's absolutely trying to remain true to the fact of that gigantic dimension of the exoskeletal structure. To have it, by the way, dominate, as you would, the other scale, the scale of the curtain wall, although he keeps the spandrel plate, the power in this, the great Hancock of Chicago, is that these diagonal struts are manifesting that colossal scale. And then at a distance, it does what your building does. It collapses into a graphic. And so I guess my question would be, is yours a variation on the theme? Is it a more contemporary version of this? You could say it's more contemporary, you say, because it floats between pure image making, which is not somehow what architecture should be guarding, but it's outside of the problematic of architecture. It doesn't have to do with the tectonic, the structural, sort of embodiment problem. But, here brilliantly, in a way, by virtue of this distancing, which you described also, the difference between being near and far, this turns into a very contemporary building. It just turns into graphic. So wouldn't that do for you? How do you, again, you talk about end games. I think you've gone further, but I'm not sure if it's further or a variation on where we were then with this, let's say, and this would be late modern.
Right.
Pre-postmodern.
Yeah, I would say, I show a lot of images of like timber work construction in the black and white Bavarian facades, and how super graphic they are. They are always dark tar painted or gray on white. But the reason why, that work was built the way it was is because you stacked up all the bricks and everything in between, because otherwise you'd have to apply it to the face to cover it up. And in a funny way, with curtain wall technology being what it is, it usually goes over the face of structure. We wouldn't have sent the structure to the edge of the building and then had to go through the nightmare of like triangulating all the glass to fit in to the puzzle pieces in between.
Yeah, but you said they're all one-offs still. I mean, there's still a great deal. You can call it a nightmare, but it's still a very custom problem, a customized kind of construction.
It was hard enough making the rectangles work, I would say.
So you'd say that the graphic is still a more efficient means to this end. And is that really what it is? Or is it more contemporary than this? I'd be curious. Would you say you're talking about interesting and good? I mean, what about contemporary, new and old? I mean, is yours newer than this? I mean,
no, I would just say that it engages, let's say, the value of let's say, contemporary communication in a way that this SOM would have never asked, which is they would never ask the frame to do anything other than what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, but this turns right into the graphical condition in a way. I'm arguing that despite whatever they said or wanted to do, that's very much doing what you do.
I agree that it is, and you could also say that it's doing it more economically.
I don't know if it's more economic, but it's doing it.
That's what you're inferring.
No, I'm not saying more economic. I'm just saying it's already happening there, and you needn't resort to the graphical. In other words, the tectonic solution would do it too. I don't know if it's better or not. I'm just wondering why you prefer the graphical version.
I would just also remind you that the scale of that is so big that the blinds aren't going to get in the way of that. In our building,
you could put it on the outside, just like he did. Sorry.
You're
then
right.
You'd really have the structure out of your way.
You're right.
Sorry. Okay. No, but I think it's interesting. I don't want to be right. That makes me nervous. Okay, now look at this. Here we are in Seattle. Okay, now, I wanted to ask you something else. Somebody could say, you're not really a modern architect. You're very much a postmodern architect because you make so ambiguous the problem of what is and is not structural. You make the graphical and the structural blend. There's a kind of, and you've already said it, you merge these systems in a way. Let's say by putting the large system on the glass, which is really part of the small system, just to name. I mean, see, this is more old-fashioned. I mean, Koolhaas is much more dated. You could argue if you think teleologically about modern architecture, he keeps these systems absolutely separate: the gigantic system and the micro system of the skin. And then he would allow his exoskeleton only to exist utterly independently. I mean, never graphically superimposing or any such things. No such games are played there. And I just like to hear a little bit more about your sympathies with your own project. I mean, because I understand the ambitions, but they're not that different than this or the Hancock in terms of effect, in terms of, what they're doing with these questions of scale. They're just different idiomatically. So somehow you haven't yet gotten to the point of explaining to us your idiomatic project, in my opinion. You're still talking a bit too broadly about it, if I may say so. I wanted to hear a little more finer grain. I mean, believe it or not, because you're about the finest grained architect there is. No one has come and showed us the section and been able to say, that the way in which the spandrel disappears is, of such profound consequence. So you do it, and yet still, I wanted the discourse around the idiomatic to get a little more detailed here. So that's why I want you to make the distinction between yourself and these two. So it's not a matter of whether it's better or worse, more efficient or not. There's something else that must be making you do this because it's very specific to your project. And it's not to see, it's not, Koolhaas, it's not, it's not Herzog and de Meuron. It's not a lot of these other guys who have similar problems with scale that you're having. I mean, or have posed similar challenges, introduced similar problematics, but in very different ways.
But you sort of say that at one level, let's say in this case, the regardless of the main structure for the building, the one thing about that is it's a texture map. It's undifferentiated.
Right.
It doesn't do anything different at the corners, right? There's a joint or a molding condition at the corners. So at one level, the main thing that this does, which I'm interested in as a technique, which is basically defamiliarizing scale, because the horizontal joints occurring at 3 or 4 floors makes this look like a stacked building of 4 chunks rather than 12 floors.
Of course.
So I feel like in many ways I respond positively to that and find that. But the level of disclosure in what we're doing is, so much more transparent and obvious, right?
Turned up, ratcheted
right,
up.
Right.
I mean, you don't just let that stuff hover behind like those X's do there.
Right.
Like ghost of the X's of the superstructure.
Right. And our building won't change graphically so dramatically from night to day, whereas this one, of course, the building becomes a kind of lantern with a series of floors in it. In our case, you'll see floors and so forth coming through at night, but actually I wanted to have the same reading at the day during the night, where transparency wasn't the key to, let's say, make the building let's say, read the structure in relief at night. So,
yeah, but there's an investment in this graphical and in the collapse to skin deep, to less than skin deep, to a some zero dimension. That architecture in yours is in a way depthless. I mean, it's absolutely like the skin on the fuselage. It's painted on. It's painted architecture in a way. I mean, the deep stuff is altogether just.
I think we can explore this maybe in some of the interiors a bit more, but.
Okay. Now, and I wanted now a little bit for you to reflect on the other idiomatic element in your work that has been known so widely and everyone recognized you advanced, which was this case about the single surface and the fillet, which, was really an obsession in the academy for, and maybe it still is, we could say. I think there are many students who still cannot escape from the thrill of that fillet. I don't, what is the thrill of the fillet? Is the fillet, AutoCAD just, it's the command? Or is it the command, that comes down from the heavens on us? What is this lure, this attraction to the fillet? What's it about? Can you just answer that first? Because, you've got it. All over your work. You've got to tell us.
I can show you with a couple of the projects. Maybe that might be the best thing.
But broadly speaking, you can't tell me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. Without describing what it particularly does in each case, in a way I didn't want you to kind of go into, well, it does this here and it does that there. There must be some broader reason. Because it kind of, if it reappears so much, it has a life of its own, I would argue, in your work. And it does. It is one of the primary elements in your work. Yeah.
Well, I think that to a certain extent, I would say since the 80s, the set of references which I was dealing with, this kind of heavy technological ones, eventually became a set of references about a kind of shell that was, let's say, injection molded rather than put together in a factory. In other words, I started looking at things that were much smaller scale. And the kind of ergonomic nature of those things probably was a big influence on it. Secondly, when you raise it to the scale of architecture, I call it a kind of high economy device, which everybody knows it's sort of about removing the corner, from wall surfaces. And it's a high economy project in the sense that it doesn't really remove floors and treat everything like some odd topology. It doesn't necessarily completely remove the Cartesian reference, but in the case of this project in '96 in Tokyo, we had this space. It was built in a box, and so what I was trying to do was do the least amount possible to essentially make a project that wanted at the same time to reject that paradigm. So agreeably, it was symbolic. Agreeably, it couldn't be argued in any performance, characteristics or criteria. meaning, you can't shove a piece of furniture up next to it. If you do, it needs to be customized and built in. Yeah. And at one level, that aspect of the project has that dissonance between a kind of close-fit modernism, a kind of gridded modernism against which, let's say, surface geometry was going to create a dissonance or a fissure between the body, landscape, furniture, envelope. I was just trying to see what could happen with that and what kind of new territory could come out of it. And at the same time, it's probably also there just because it's overall the sense of geometry. There's no 3D curves in this. So at this moment, it had to be a developable surface project. It couldn't be, three-dimensionally curving. I didn't want to suffer the problem of too little budget for too high of an ambition. And so it became a project about economy, and that's why it could be copied so easily, is because it's eminently plain and, pretty simple. And I would say this idea of economy, which going back to the Hancock Tower, why don't you just do it like that? It's a sort of first order of, expression. It is interesting for me to think about slightly odd or taboo ways to deal with making other things happen in architecture that don't have to do with economy in the modernist sense. But making a radius instead of a corner isn't that big of a deal, construction-wise, and yet I saw the payoff as being quite high in terms of the defamiliarizing effect, that you would have on, the project.
But this is where you begin the category, the introduction of this category of the interior as envelope, which I think distinguishes your work from everybody in our generation. I mean, honestly, no one has created this interior shell to the extent that you have with this degree of control and differentiation from other types of interior. And I wanted to just ask you, this is a different project, but these are exterior shell projects again, but
Endeavor?
The Endeavor
I think
does
that's
something, I think, very paradoxical that I wanted to ask you about. If we can come back to this, the Type A.
These are the banks. You can keep just going forward to Endeavor.
But the Endeavor project that I wanted to speak with you about is the office space for Endeavor, where the shell is not only encasement, a kind of purely a surface condition, but begins to make partitions and staircases. It actually turns out that this element, this shell that seems to be something like cladding, like we see on your exterior operations with it, it unfolds into and embodies the space. I mean, I think it's very compelling. For example, here we see that it makes of itself a partition, this invasive surface here. Here it's cut away to be a receptacle for the wall, which is kind of a paradox in the context that it also behaves as surface, as wall, as the space-making element. It is as much the space-making as the cladding. It seems to operate on so many different levels, programmatically and spatially, in ways that exterior envelopes cannot. I mean, you won't have here the same way. You will not be asked the question about the symbolic versus the actuality to the extent that you would on the exterior. And that's very interesting because most interior architecture today is a kind of outfitting which seems to be supplementary. And I would say in your project, the interior is the much more fundamental, the more deeply modern, actually, part of your work. I am very, very, I have to say, your interiors, I think, are the, really a high mark in that way, for that reason.
One of the things that we were talking about at lunch, which was sort of about the perception of one's career. You don't get to build for a long time, so was it somebody who didn't want to and who somehow dumb luck allowed them to spend somebody else's money, but really they should just be condemned to draw for their whole life? I don't know what anybody, ever thought about that. But as we agreed, it's the wrong sort of idea to sort of think that if you don't get a chance to build something, that you've just rejected commissions for years and years while you sort of work on ideas. But for me, when we did the little project in Tokyo, which was 14 years ago only, and it was the first thing that I got to build, quite honestly, the desire to build a building made the thing become a building inside of a building, rather than looking at it like, great, we get to do a little interior. In fact, we weren't asked to build anything. We were just asked to ship the models and the drawings over to have an exhibition. And I said, give me the entire budget to ship all the stuff over, because it was like $100,000, and let me build something. And they agreed to do it.
You shipped the model, which was the building.
Basically, the model, the project was an experimental version of a full-scale, project, for which, whether it was sitting in a field or inside an existing building, the ambition to build was so powerful and had been for so long. I actually think that's one of the reasons why there's no sort of distinguishing between what does it mean for us to do an interior than an autonomous building.
So what's that so interesting? Because, you hear there are architects whose trajectory is, like you said, draw for years. Then there's this house or whatever. Yeah. That you moved in interiors, that's something that sometimes happens. But that you always had the ambition to deal with the entirety of architecture. It seems to me that the main preoccupation was the whole building. You weren't somebody who had a kind of partial view. And so then when you try to embody the whole of architecture only in an interior, it kind of unfolds in this supercharged way as the whole of it there. And that's why it's like the shell of the building, but now inverted, interiorized.
Right.
I think it's very compelling. Actually, that explains a lot. I think today, for example, if I may be critical of today's culture, not you not being part of some things in today's, the tessellation, the fascination with the making super wrought these surfaces that define interiors today, or even define the whole building. I think the ambition is very different. Let's say this kind of super refinement of the surface development, and yours is in the tradition of the synthesis of all parameters. That is the program sequence, the idea of cladding, structure, the plastic definition of space. It's all in this surface, despite the inarticulateness of the surface. In fact, the suppression, the high degree of control it takes to suppress any of the ruptures and the interruptions. The degree to which you've controlled sprinkler lighting and everything. Your patterns are the most controlled I've seen. It's one of the most integrated surfaces. These are not like so many interiors we have where all of that stuff and all the consultants and everything that is not so coordinated get in your way. They become part of this process of utter synthesis, total synthesis. I think it's super compelling. Actually, the idea that the exterior is more like an interior, one could argue, is also compelling in your work. If we were to go to the next logical step and say, well, on the outside, we see many of the attributes we normally do on the inside, that decoration and structure are confused categorically or mixed, and the piece and the whole is much more conflicted. In a funny and interesting way, you could say, because of that interiority of this Highline, it makes sense that some of these interior sensibilities should be exhibited as an outdoor space, outdoor condition. So maybe we can theoretically redeem it that way. But I think the inside is where I really see this distinction that really separates you from a lot of what's happening now. Although, by the way, I don't quite think you've answered, and I guess we can continue to develop it, and we will turn over to the audience soon. This issue about your preference vis-a-vis your approach as opposed to others on the matter of the single surface, the way you do it, on the matter of the way you calibrate the representation of multiple scales with graphic, not with other means, not with tectonic means. All of those things which make you who you are, and not like anyone else, really. Well, you were going to show me this, but very quickly. This is the museum. Is that right? He wanted to show me a museum. Neil said, I've got to show you this. So if you could bear with us very quickly, we'll do this, and then we really should open up.
Yeah.
I'd like to just hear you tell us.
Only out of your obsession or to deal with them programmatically kind of at this point. But also it's a project from about 6 months ago, and at one level the phenomena of the kind of continuous surface, which was super diagrammatic, in the green piece, of which it started out with, if you only need one, then it could reach this kind of high economy level. Again, kind of, it's not ironic to talk about economy in the modernist sort of sense, but I'm also, in many respects, my stuff is pretty restrained. My work is pretty, your work, for instance, I would say, in its appearance, it's also incredibly economical, but the way in which the geometry works sectionally, I would say, is far more charged than ours, which tends to work a little bit more, let's say, binary, make a hole in a surface or something like that. In which case there are, but for instance, this is a site on a river in Maribor in Slovenia. It's a small town, about 100,000 people, and they had a competition for a museum. It's right on the corner of the old city, and there's a new promenade that's going to happen on the waterfront. There was a second part to the program to do housing or community center and kindergarten and stuff in the back. But anyway, the building site is really 3 or 4 pieces that morph into a super site responsive project. And in many ways, I don't look at this as being, about single surfaces or about specific graphic forms of continuity, although when you look at, let's say, that particular type of profile right there, and the way in which that geometry more or less articulates the edge of the site but then moves to the interior, there's aspects of continuity with it, but in terms of the way in which the profile works, we're actually more interested in increasing surfaces and breaking things down more than ever, even though the homogeneity of the material sort of puts it all, back together again. But this is one main circulation void that essentially connects the public space to the galleries, and the building also has an odd condition in that it seems more like 2 buildings rather than that morphology looks sort of coherent at some particular level in terms of the merger of, there's a big truss right here, and the galleries move across this truss, and of course the circulation moves across that truss. So here's where the profile and the other truss makes it look like almost 2 buildings. There's the 2 buildings happening in section. They're kind of...
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
What's going on here? Why are you doing... What's this game of depth, of curling in? Wait, look how different that is than... Here you cut. You're cutting the surface here. You're revealing its thickness in a very straightforward sectional way, which is what you usually do. But
right.
Why are you switching to this
right.
kind of depth? This representation of depth that way?
Because
I'm surprised.
It's becoming more and more a kind of
sorry, tell me.
Specific relationship between the sign form of depth, architecture, action, time, and so forth, versus that which doesn't have any depth, which, let's say, perforation shows how thin 5 millimeter material is and so forth.
But the cut, as opposed to this.
Yes. So the building and the stuff that we're interested in now is a kind of shifting relationship between what I call sort of stop action. The stop being the building either cut in section or the interior cut in section.
Yeah.
A moment of repose, you're outside of the idea of space in a way disembodied, like reading the section of a drawing.
Okay.
Versus depth, which is about action, projection, experience, curvature, and so forth. And that's happening both in terms of space, like in Endeavor, and here this becomes a kind of obvious relationship between a perforated skin that's just a skin and a form of depth which wraps around the structure. It's a rhetorical trope. I'm trying to kind of argue that becomes a kind of expanded bandwidth of program and logic for us.
You're introducing multiple temporalities in a way.
Yes.
With the cut versus this versus the
Yes.
perforating. Okay, because a museum would have to have that, presumably.
You would know.
I would know. Okay. This is a little bit like the Ningbo. I mean, I wish you'd brought where, there is that depth. But in the module, this is
Right.
But this is a one-off, an
Right.
exceptional episode where you normally deal with it in systematic
You can see
terms.
it. You can see it happening in this window over here.
Yeah.
And so, meanwhile, this is kind of a shaped body for the site with these very, very specific localized voids and windows that sort of work, in a field to themselves in terms of how you circulate. And I would say this building is sort of, in that sense, less controlled compositionally and more like a kind of site-responsive solid that's been sort of shaped very much relative to the forces of the site. And in that sense, it's deeply related, I think, to HL23. HL23 as a prism, I wouldn't sit there if it was in a field. I wouldn't make that building that particular way. It would be far more sort of controlled by will rather than contingency. So this project is sort of similar to that. That's the upper lobby that gets you into this slot. It's basically a hole cut in this diagonal slab that transgresses a giant truss. And the thing that we're doing here is this giant serrated, perforated skin, which is a super graphic contrast to the plaster ceiling. That's a trope that we've been exploring for quite a while, and there it is going down. And these kinds of profiles are really an index of the relationship between that Boolean operation and the torquing surface of this, kind of floating ceiling, basically. And the plan, it pretty much resonates in that way. And here's where the void turns into a solid. It's a bit like the A320 in the Guggenheim. In this case, it's the end of this void turning into basically a figure. It's got glass wrapped around the outside.
Interior, just like
Exactly.
Guggenheim is.
With the basic galleries as a kind of ground to that figure. It's not a circular space, obviously, but
You're the ghost of the giant scale. In the Coulhasian way, almost. It's just behind the skin.
I see.
Yeah, you didn't graphically bring it to the skin.
No.
So we have many idiomatic strategies, actually. I mean, this one is one of the most diverse of the projects.
Anyway.
Okay, well, we've touched on a number of things. I'd love to hear some reactions and take Neil to task further, or, well, you can take me to task too, for the questions I raised or didn't raise, but anything that's on your mind. Well, Mr. Waxman, I welcome you to bring to the floor a question.
Thanks. I really don't think that you can divorce your architecture as like a tectonic and material project, as also as an experiential project, from this graphic and the two-dimensional qualities of the section and the elevation that I think are registered in the projects. They seem really bound together, almost as if the architecture can't exist without these two-dimensional qualities. I mean, for instance, in addition to the fillet, there you have these types of these angles that just keep reoccurring in your work. I mean, you have it in the HL23, you have it in this one. Like in HL23, you see them, well, I mean, the excuse you give for them is that it allows you to get more floor space. And then, you see the graphic when you're farther away of the tectonics represented through these angles, and then as you approach and you start to curve around it, then you start to, distorts that graphic experience. But, I mean, I think that those angles are suggestive of a way in which you're conceiving the architecture and of an experience of architecture that is embedded within the graphic modes of representing architecture through section and elevation. And that, when a human being experiences that, I mean, that's something, you're totally translating at the same time. But I guess, can you address these angles? Can you address what this question what I have about the binding between the two-dimensional representational techniques and the physical geometric project at the same time?
It would be probably a mistake to sort of walk away from, this conversation thinking that I was anything but like a straightforward architect, like trying to build, a project that's super responsive to, sites and programs and things like that. And I'm not trying to kind of brand the work or brand myself, in any way other than part of the meditation and the preoccupation that I've had for a long, long time. And Scott and I were talking about this at the very beginning, like he was asking about drawing. And I said, drawing doesn't have anything to do with what I'm interested in. I've always said I'm interested in designing and not drawing. But I am interested in the graphic, and I'm interested in it deeply in terms of the way in which it affects our lives. And rather than separate that out and say, well, I guess that's all of another set of issues in media for which architecture can't or is not allowed, to deal with. I'm just like anybody who's trying to not bolster architecture or make it do more than what it's supposed to do, as though it's always has a lack. It's not really that. It's not a theoretical premise in that particular sense. It really is experiential in that way, and it's just an experiment to see if there's a possible mode of existence where building doesn't become cheaper or more superficial. It doesn't become less robust. It doesn't become less memorable because it works in the way in which the ephemeral works or the image works. That's at the end of the day not what I want. I mean, after all, there's a building, it's sitting there, and it won't just disappear when you decide you're tired of it. So I agree that there is a bit of a risk and there's a bit of a taboo in the general phenomenon subject that you could probably get in trouble with because we're not supposed to pull in the stuff which works materially against architecture. And that very sense of it not wanting to be there attracts me. And so far it's been a worthwhile experience because when you can go into these spaces or see these projects, I think there's a dimension, whether you can put your finger on it or not, that kind of catalyzes experience. I'd have to say positively rather than it becoming an alienating thing, because for sure what we're not interested in doing is alienating or repelling. Actually, it's quite a warm and fuzzy poetic project. I want people to embrace and enjoy, the spaces in a way. But I think you're right. The pretext or the subtext of this whole idea of the graphic is not a story to tell and then, oh, by the way, we got to build a building along with it. It's very much connected to probably a very serious, desire to construct. And that's why I think we build so precisely.
Most of your graphic is architectural, in the sense that it's a representation of architecture. But, I go back to the airplane because I was struck by the fact that, it's ironic, but you put your initials on the plane, but, it could have just as well have been an airline.
Well, that was the other...
have you thought about other content, other graphics for your buildings, other than graphics that represent the building?
In and of themselves, in terms of the way in which they cohere as a thing about opacity or transparency or about the nature.
Those are letters.
Do you mean literal typography?
I guess, or other things, flowers, or whatever it may be. No, graphic representations of all sorts of things, any number of any other thing. Think of Herzog and Imran, for example, who have put print patterns of so many different kinds of images on their buildings. I'm curious. I hadn't thought about it, but why aren't there images of other things in your graphics other than the architecture?
I would say because the direct application of images, which we've done maybe in other ways or through media, is not going to allow us to contribute anything to the discussion which is already going on out there, which is why it's a harder discussion to sort of work, quote, abstractly within the nature of perception as opposed to direct communication with typography or iconography or something like that.
Yoshiko. Sure, go for it.
I see your building all the time because I'm a New Yorker. And there's one quality about your work, which is a tautness of surface, tautness of skin. And it's because your structure is endoskeletal, not exoskeletal. In between, there's a surface of skin. By that graphic, it does emphasizes the tautness further, so that it expresses structure as more elastic element as opposed to static elements. I think that's really important because we move around and all of a sudden it looks like a stretched netting instead of conceiving it as a static structure. So I think that's really interesting. And because you do have a Filat detailing in flat graphics, you see it as a corrective. It's a bit of cosmetic gesture you have to make it more beautiful and elastic than what it really is. But in New York context, it totally, to me, is legitimate. So why can't you do such a gesture to make it much more elastic and taut, provide more tension to provide an edge of beauty to it. So I think it does provide an interesting tension. You can only do that on surface, and that's why I understand you really do not use imagery as a graphic, but there's a purpose to it, which to me is highly architectural thought. Also, it looks like a decorative technique.
And if it were not architectural, that is, if it were some other
right, it's some images, it will be a decoration.
It would override that reading.
For that, I would say Herzog de Meuron's technique is highly decorative.
Yeah, this is more tectonic.
Right, compared to Neof's. Yeah. And then there's no tension in skin in REMS building, no SM building. So I think there's interesting elements you bring up. This particular ethereal element, sometimes we ignore as a tectonic element. So that's my read of it.
That is the distinction. Oh, so that would be the exterior distinction, and the interior is that malleable and much more plastic manifestation of three-dimensional behaviors of the surface. It's interesting.
The interior detail has a nice pin connection, with a beveled, tube, and it as a field, your perception could be countered by another person who would say, you went to all the trouble to make that detail, let us see it, right, in the building, because that's, the most, direct project. And actually thinking about it as a kind of corrective idea or a smoothing, technique, one might feel like if you had a badly constructed joint, you might, do that like a piece of tape. And ours are beautifully detailed and beautifully modeled in a way. And so the corrective, of course, isn't literal in that sense because the craft goes through it. But it does make me think about the wish. You've seen them, all the white renders of sort of injection molded buildings, right? Mm-hmm. The wish for the smoothness of part to whole to just sort of kind of go away, and the exigencies of building won't allow that.
Yes,
literally no budget will allow it. And to a certain extent, that's also partly why we did it, is to be able to smooth out not a lack of craft, but in a way the way in which strand turns into surface, and to do it in that way as well. Now that's more of an internal discussion, as opposed to the public will read it that way.
Mm-hmm. But they will see it, whether they know it that way or not. Yes. Someone.
He has a very loud and clear voice.
Good.
He's good.
Thank you. No, I think I'll really go like this.
No, you have to do it because we try to
recording.
Keep it recording.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a question. Would you want your work to be kind of guiding to the future generations to a degree where could you want that, the fact that kind of half of the world is already built and most of what gets built is not built by architects laid beside, would you want that what you do here, your what you experiment on style and all that would become kind of generic and become kind of what the future city looks like? For example, just the image that I have in front of me. Do you think, or do you want this to become like the fabric of the future of say a whole city. And I mean, the question why I ask, I guess, is it kind of points at the defamiliarization, which you kind of raised more than once. It kind of points at, kind of what the value of defamiliarization is, because I guess, I mean, I'm coming from Switzerland, where I guess the idea is more to kind of build up upon the integrity of architecture that has kind of prevailed within, all times of history. So kind of, it's kind of a connecting with what we can see as integer, besides all of the, things that modernists said and whoever said. We're kind of trying to get it integer and kind of generating a law for new buildings. So, yeah.
That, I would say, first of all, no, I'm not putting this work out as some sort of new contemporary generic or future generic, or its idiosyncrasies becoming sort of more and more useful, as it were, or something like that. But if on the one hand, the last 10 years, let's say from 2000 to 2008, architecture either fostered through the media or by architects with the possibility to build, super big, spectacular projects like Beijing or something. A lot of, sublime stuff got built, a lot of projects that experimented with geometry, structure, and because, the money was there. If you put that into a category of spectacle, and on the one hand, all the stuff that you mentioned that's not done by architects as being generic, background, silent witness, on the one hand, I could possibly, just for the sake of, driving an argument, for 10 years there was only two kinds of architecture you could do. One, super spectacular, or two, background. And I never think of what I do as being either one. Some people would classify it in the spectacle range because it's weird or odd or something like that. But, we could go further with the geometry and go further out and make it sort of either uglier or more beautiful or more anybody can, right? It's not a matter of technique or craft. And so if there's anything about this work, I would say that it wants to oscillate between being noticeable and unnoticeable. And that, in that sense, I've never fostered a kind of polarizing architectural position. Like I'm into the big sublime grotesque thing, or I believe in the morality of, the silent witness architecture. I've never operated in that kind of easy debate field. So at some level, if this work brings up the idea that there's a particular way in which the morphology or performance criteria of architecture did, let's say, become affective or noticeable, and if that did urban work, because I still don't believe architecture is just meant to entertain. But who wants to live in a world of boring stuff? And so defining what's not boring either as good, all the silent witness background stuff, or interesting dancing elephants, look at me.
Can you do good in the silent witness? Why? Your house, that green house that I skipped.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe in L.A. because you've been in L.A. for so long, that's not noticeable. But, and it is good. I'm willing to give you that. But if you were to go for the silent witness that's good, I mean, I don't think that's what that is. I haven't seen you do a disappearing architecture. You haven't. I mean,
No.
This idea that it's not noticeable, I don't see it.
I think our stuff is more on the noticeable side.
Yeah.
I know that.
Thank you.
I know
I
that.
just want to clarify, except in L.A. where, maybe everything is
I'm
potentially not noticeable.
I'm just saying. You're going to regret that when you get a big commission in LA.
Okay. Believe me, I'll try to shout very loudly.
No, I'm not trying to be a magician and go, this is not what you're looking at. I think I'm just trying to kind of work off of your question, which is a bit like, what what good, will translate out of this that becomes sort of useful or kind of permanent to, to culture in a way. And I don't think any architect could, sort of go, I'm pretty sure that this stuff is going to, have this kind of eternal effect or long-lasting effect. We build for a particular condition, and, time, kind of works after that. And, I can't say, but I'm trying to fathom an answer, to the question at one particular level. And I do think that some of the investigations about how the building would work, even if it's just about lighting, or even if it's a more obscure way in which surfaces move from flat to deep, can kind of charge the way in which, buildings could do something other than be spectacular and entertain and become a monument automatically, versus be engaged in a particular way. And I guess as a sensibility, and I know it's hard to put one's finger on it, but that's what I'm trying to go for, as a sensibility, as opposed to something that mediates or produces difference at every possible, turn. I don't know if that answers your question, but your question is loaded. It was a trap I didn't want to fall into. Making.
Is he one of your students?
He is.
Oh, I like that.
He is. We've
a
already
good question.
we've already had
You
many
gotta
good.
admit it.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Couple more.
Yeah.
Kind of coming on from what Scott just said, actually, what would you say the role of LA is in your work, especially as a technocratic metropole?
Technocratic. Just explain that a little bit.
Well, I'll expand that also from LA, into California as well as a whole, but as a center of technology, and as well as an embracing of technology as ideology.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wrapping my head around all this because I'm in Chris Reeg's class. I'm trying to figure it out.
Something about your idiom is LA-ish, is what he's.
Is that
I
right?
think he's trying to get at. Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
I think there's
even
an
if
issue,
none of these
too.
projects that you showed today are in LA.
I'm sorry?
Even if none of these projects you showed today are in LA, yeah, I still have that aura.
Let's see. This isn't being posed, obviously, as a implicit coastal debate thing.
No, there's no Biggie
wouldn't want to go there.
Tupac at all.
Because I have to answer that one all the time.
Okay.
Technology, which you used in technocrat and the noun and so forth, I want to caution a little bit that you'll fall into a kind of journalistic quickness if you think my main number one concern is employing technology in architecture. I think if you look at my stuff, you'll see actually hundreds of architects who probably use the same materials with the same processes. If this is where the kind of history in the 80s can either become a kind of heavyweight, and it's okay. It's part of the world. And again, there's maybe residue. We design the lights and stuff, and they're cool, and they're made out of aluminum, and that factors into a kind of sensibility of the technical. That's fine. I'm not so mean as to say that your literacy of looking at these images is off base or something like that. LA being obviously the 20th century city where cinema and aerospace came together because of sun and an open landscape and so forth, a city that was crafted based on giant kind of mega industries, less about retirement, and that was created with Palm Springs as the separate, sort of desert satellite. One would usually say, well, LA, it's very dystopic and Ballardian and spread out and problematic and driving and it's a petro mess, petrochemical car-based, starting to talk about urbanism that is colored by kind of the problematics of North American urbanism, which is it's about sprawl and so forth. The sensibility of our work now is probably more informed by Japan than anything, because I've spent, a total of almost 2.5 years of my life in Tokyo, when you add it all up. And so issues probably about the nature of media are very present and apparent there. Issues of how that media relates to money and real estate are very apparent there. They're not in LA. And I would have to, in issues of scale shift, product design, graphic design. I went to Japan for the first time in 1990, and that's when this kind of sense of, well, what can I do with the work coincided with this conversation with Sanford and so forth. So that's more probably informative at some particular level. I think after that,
Interesting.
we're all part of a kind of global, culture for which it's pretty vague as to how our home cities become played out or affect our work, whether it's there or, in other places. I think probably the best thing to answer the question would be, go look at your database of all of the images and all the projects that you've collected, architects, BArchies working, Toshiko and everywhere. And what does it mean to work in other places, or how can you track or trace the Heimat, the German term for the local? Does everybody have a Heimat, element in their work today? Peter Zumthor is the most obvious one. And I'm not sure that's what you're asking, but you're asking of what kind of influence directly does a city have or does LA have on the work? And it's not to disown the city, because it's where, I've chosen to work and teach and so forth, and it's there, but it's definitely not a kind of one-to-one grafting of any condition or phenomena in a way. LA is too vague in that sense. It's too much something that you have to build up in your head, as opposed to being a territory of, obvious, kind of references.
But your point of departure from Tokyo is really different, for example, than if we were to look at the biography of Frank Gehry, who,
Yes.
in beginning in L.A., looking at the very straightforward tectonics of very inexpensive buildings.
How to build and,
and
very different.
a kind of vernacular condition of the commercial, commercial
Yeah.
landscape.
Yeah.
You're not, I'm thinking now of your work in L.A., and it is not L.A., actually. The more as I'm sitting here, it's strikingly foreign in a way, actually, in that environment.
Maybe one more?
One more. Okay. Neil says one more. That's
One
going to
more.
be it. We have one more?
Anyone? No? Okay.
Oh, BArch. Perfect.
Last one for
Great
Bjarke.
ending. Okay.
See?
Okay.
No, it was maybe just try to ask the question very openly to begin with. Have you ever contemplated the differences and similarities between? Because I think there is a kind of parallel destiny, but without, I think, having influenced each other. But have you ever contemplated the trajectories of your sort of work and career and that of Zaha Hadid, actually? Because otherwise I would try. But I would be more interested to hear if you have about it yourself.
No, I have not.
Okay, so I was just thinking, because both of you, and I'm not saying that any of you have been looking at each other's work, apart from the fact that Filat have also lately appeared in her work. But I think which is probably unrelated. But I think in both of you, you started really developing a kind of graphic, sort of artistic, aesthetic style that I remember, some of your sort of earliest projects before you actually started building them. It was very much that there was so much work invested in the visual representation that you almost had doubts that they were even supposed to be translated into physical space, and or if it could be done. And it's the same with Zaha. She developed her sort of paintings that seemed impossible until the fire station was the first proof. And in your case, your fire station would be the Tokyo. And suddenly, like you like just this idea of like spending so much time investing in a graphic universe as a way of almost like working in peace for like maybe too long or like very long, but that also means that when you finally break into building, you have sort of you're so emancipated because you've been operating in such a long time, untormented by like the laws of gravity, that maybe you have like a much more sort of a holistic universe to offer. So in that sense, it's less referencing like the practicalities of daily construction that an earlier bloomer might face.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think it kind of ties in a little bit to the kind of issue of drawing, and especially American architects, which we don't have a competition system here. We can't. Generally, people don't get good chances in their 30s or something like that. So at many levels, that's just sort of what you do. I mean, all the people in Jesse, Hanny, you, we didn't get projects until much later on, and so we weren't writing texts and sort of thinking, so it had to be drawn at some particular level. I think the issue with, say, Zaha, that for me is really fascinating and why I appreciate what she does. When she did the fire station, number one, she decided to build it in concrete as opposed to steel. And number two, it had no color on the outside. And when you looked at all of the stuff, it was basically hyper-colored and you didn't know what it was made of. And here she gets the project in Germany and very smartly makes we're going to build it in concrete because that's what they do here. Of course, there's a lot of steel inside, and there's not going to be any color on it because let's just make it fucking sober. And sorry for that.
So uncharacteristic.
Sorry. That's okay.
It's all being written down.
Is this being brought? And don't you think that what I relate to that is all the drawings and all of the distorted paintings and the flying parallax and everything, that there was a sense, because in this work that it could be relatively and immediately translated, because it wasn't a naive project to go, well, it'll be all distorted and all colored all at the same time because that's what we drew. And I feel very much, connected to that, because whatever it was that I was drawing, there were some changes even in the drawn projects before we got to be able to build them, because I wasn't confident that there'd ever be enough money or technique to be able to make these projects realizable. That's also why they were drawn so specifically, because I knew that they would only have a graphic life, and that for them to have weight and power, they needed to be obsessively committed to that level. And all I'm doing is doing the same thing in building that I did in drawing, with the same level of obsession and so forth. But I didn't ever, and this was the great thing about Zaha, I would have predicted that she would suffer a crisis of translation from all the drawings, and that the first couple of things she would have built would have been horrible, because you just can't do that, or the paint's going to chip off, or something bad will happen. And I was impressed from the very beginning with that ability to be able to get to that point, and I think that's why she's been able to do what she's done, and I think that's a great thing for everybody to kind of learn in terms of disciplining your work even prior to its commitment to construction. You don't have to be safe about it and go, well, I need to be safe now so that when I'm ready to build it, it'll be okay. I think you figure out ways to imbue your work with the same energy, and she did. And that's the best lesson. And I think about that a lot, but I haven't patterned a career or, studied the work in a scholarly kind of way. Although you can't it's a reference. It's a touchstone for contemporary practice. I was just talking to Patrick Schumacher about the Guangzhou theater and so forth that they did, and how they were building it and what went wrong. And I think, boy, if you can get a conversation with them, because they're building challenging, difficult things, you'd make some mental notes about what to do and what not to do.
But implicit in, I think, or explicit in what the arc said is that an architect who at first only draws or is out of the world that what you call early bloomer is in, which is more pragmatic and more rooted in construction. Implicit in that is a greater freedom or an imagination that might not confront construction in predictable ways. I think it's a very interesting.
But even in because I think specifically in the two cases, because I think most architects suffer sort of a lifelong career of not building anything they're drawing, but some like I think you and Saha did, like somehow made a project, like exactly maybe they sort of made the graphic representation so rich and so innovative on its own terms that it got a life of its own
in the build. Yeah, I think it's true, and I think it's carrying on, even if it's not about drawing. As you said, it's about graphic. It's not about drawing.
Mm-hmm.
That was a very clear and precise way to put it. Neil, I really enjoyed it. Thank you, and we'll continue the conversation.
Thanks for coming. Parallax and everything, that there was a sense, because in this work that it could be relatively and immediately translated, because it wasn't a naive project to go, well, it'll be all distorted and all colored all at the same time, because that's what we drew. And I feel very much, connected to that, because whatever it was that I was drawing, there were some changes even in the drawn projects before we got to be able to build them, because I wasn't confident that, there'd ever be enough money or, technique to be able to make, these projects realizable. That's also why they were drawn so specifically, because I knew that they would only have a graphic life, and that for them to have weight and power, they needed to be, obsessively committed to that level. And all I'm doing is doing the same thing, in building that I did in drawing, with the same level of, obsession and so forth. But I didn't ever, and this was the great thing about Zaha, I would have predicted that she would suffer a crisis of translation from all the drawings, and that the first couple of things she would have built would have been horrible, because you just can't do that, or the paint's going to chip off, or something bad, will happen. And I was impressed from the very beginning with that ability to be able to get to that point. And I think that's why she's been able to do what she's done. And I think that's a great thing for everybody to kind of learn, in terms of disciplining your work even prior to its, commitment to construction. You don't have to be safe about it and go, well, I need to be safe now so that when I'm ready to build it, it'll be okay. I think you figure out ways to imbue your work with the same energy, and she did. And that's the best lesson. And I think about that a lot, but I haven't patterned a career or, studied the work in a scholarly kind of way. Although you can't, it's a reference, it's a touchstone for contemporary practice. I was just talking to Patrick Schumacher about the Guangzhou theater and so forth that they did, and how they were building it and what went wrong. And I think, boy, if you can get a conversation with them, because they're building challenging, difficult things, you'd make some mental notes about what to do and what not to do.
But implicit in, I think, or explicit in what the arc said is that an architect who at first only draws or is out of the world that what you call early bloomer is in, which is more pragmatic and more rooted in construction. Implicit in that is a greater freedom or an imagination that might not confront construction in predictable ways. I think it's a very interesting.
But even in because I mean I think specifically in the two cases because I mean I think most architects suffer sort of a lifelong career of not building anything they're drawing, but some like I think you and Saha did like somehow made a project like exactly maybe they sort of made the graphic representation so rich and so innovative on its own terms that that it got a life of its own
in the build. Yeah, I think it's true, and I think it's carrying on, even if it's not about drawing. As you said, it's about graphic. It's not about drawing.
Mm-hmm.
That was a very clear and precise way to put it. Neil, I really enjoyed it. Thank you, and we'll continue the conversation.
Thanks for coming. Thank you.